everybody. If you think of questions as we go, please feel free to type them in the chat, and I will address them at a time that makes sense, either at the end or in the middle, depending on how this goes. So I thought we'd just start kind of on a general basis. If you could just, well, first of all, I know you have a few students in this group, but not everybody knows who you are. So if you could just introduce yourself, tell us what all you do in our community. It's a significant amount. So let's start there.
Well, my name's Austin Schlichting. Some of you guys in the orchestra here know me as Mr. Schlichting, and I'm the orchestra and choir director at River Ridge High School up in Lacey. I've been there. This is my seventh year teaching at River Ridge High School. I also am active with the Olympia Symphony, where I play viola, and have actually had two of my compositions performed and premiered by the Olympia Symphony. I also have a history with the SPSEC Symphony Orchestra, where I was concertmaster for about a year and a quarter, and then am, I believe, currently kind of an interim principal viola for the symphony, at least before everything closed down. So heavy string background for me, and teaching background. So that's my little introduction.
Great. So just kind of in a broad sense, how did you get here? What has your musical journey been?
My musical journey. Well, I was born into a very musical family. In fact, actually, Olympia High School students might find this interesting. My grandfather was the uh, orchestra teacher at Olympia High School for many years, from basically right after World War II until the 1960s. And my father, Mark Schlichting, went through the Olympia High School orchestra program under my grandfather, and then my father got after college got a position as the orchestra teacher at Bellingham High School, and I, as a high school student, got to have my father as an orchestra teacher. So there's a bit of a line there, and I could go even further and talk about my grandfather, Grandpa Fred, and his father being a music teacher, and my great grandfather and my great great grandfather being music teachers and administrators. So yeah, there's a long line there on my father's side, and on my mother's side, my mom is a pretty good pianist. She hasn't played for a while, but when she was going through school, she could play. She could throw down some Chopin and whatnot. So our family and growing up, it wasn't uncommon to have us just break out into song like the Von Trapp family singers. So actually, I thought that was very normal growing up, and as soon as I started teaching, I realized a lot of people don't have access to those types of things. So I try to bring that into the classroom as I'm teaching, and hopefully my students can attest to that. All right, so that's my background on how I became, or how I started off, and my kind of background in short is I went to Washington State University to study music composition because I really like the orchestra, not orchestra, the composition teacher there, Charles Argesinger. And if you haven't heard, by the way, I'm just going to say this right now. I might just start singing a bunch of composer names and pieces. If you wrote those down, this would be like a really good kind of roadmap of how I listen to music. So Charles Argesinger, Piano Concerto Number 1. He was working on his Piano Concerto Number 2 before he passed away. So I highly recommend you go online and check out that piece. It's a one movement piano and orchestra piece of music. But I was really enthusiastic about how he wrote music, and I wanted to study with him, so I did. And while I was at WSU, I also studied with the jazz band director Greg Yazanitsky, who's a fantastic composer. He's still there. I think he's going to retire this year. And I also studied with another composer named Ryan Hare, who kind of got me out of my shell with a lot of compositional things. So I might refer to him every once in a while. After I went to Washington State University, I went to Ithaca College in upstate New York. So if you've ever seen like The Office, that TV show, the American version of The Office, they kind of refer to that area of upstate New York a lot because it's kind of parallel to where they are in Scranton, New York. So, or Scranton, Pennsylvania. So it's in the Finger Lakes region, about an hour away from Rochester, about an hour away from Syracuse. It's really good college town with Cornell and Ithaca College. And I studied with the composer Dana Wilson, who had a really big impact on me. And I'm trying to remember, did you guys get to play Shortcut Home last year, or was that scheduled and didn't happen? I can't
If
remember.
for folks that are in at least their third year in conservatory, they played it the first 2 years ago
Nice.
in
Very cool.
March of 2019.
Very cool. Yeah. So Dana Wilson, that composer, was my teacher, and I got to know him really well while I was there for 2 years. And then after my master's, I was all set up to go to a doctoral program. And at the time, I was looking around at my friends who were getting out of these major conservatories, and they weren't finding composition jobs. And I started realizing, I need to make sure I'm able to put some food on the table. So I went back to school and got a teaching certificate. And so now I'm kind of doing I call it the Mr. Holland's opus approach to things, where I'm teaching every day, and I really enjoy interacting with students. I really enjoy watching students learn. Um, I really enjoy that aspect of teaching, and um, and I compose basically at night. So that's I don't see it as a hobby. I see it as kind of a lifestyle, and it just gets me really excited to have you guys perform one of my pieces and work on it, because that's kind of one of the reasons why I do it. All right, there we go.
Awesome. So you mentioned a number of your teachers and inspirations, but what was either the first piece you composed or your earliest experience with composition? How did you end up deciding that was what you wanted to do in college?
So when I was 9 years old, so kind of quasi bigger family. I have three older siblings. I'm the youngest of four, and uh, my older siblings all got to go do piano kind of at an earlier age. And so by the time I came around, I wasn't. It took a few years before my parents got on the bandwagon to have me do piano as well and whatnot. But I was making up pieces on the piano, making little tunes on the piano. And the very first piece I ever figured out how to write, I actually sat down and wrote it out. My dad being a music teacher, and like, what's this note? And what's this note? I want to know how to write this out on a page. Okay, that's B flat, that's sharp. Okay, great. Well, what's this note? Oh, it's a C and that's an E. And I composed this piece when I was 9 years old called Nightmare Walk, and it's just this octatonic piece. And what's really funny about that is I've gone back and looked at it and been like, that's really crazy. Like the very first piece I ever wrote was this piece in octatonic. And if you don't know what octatonic is, it's if you know the diatonic scales, like major and minor scales, the octatonic scale is a scale made up of 8 notes. That's where you get the word octa from, like octopus, octagon. It's an octatonic scale where you have a scale comprised of essentially whole steps and half steps, and it's exactly 8 notes long. So um, I was thinking about being next to my computer so I can actually kind of demonstrate that. But
I can play it for you.
okay, sure, sure.
So as he says, it alternates. I know we normally think of our normal scales as having 8 notes because we repeat the bottom and top note, but really there's only 7 notes that we use before we start over. Octatonic uses 8 different notes by alternating half step and whole step. So we would have something like this. Um,
Yep.
so it's a little bit of a different flavor, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. And there's composers like Bartok. You might want to write that name down, Bartok, who use octatonic scales. My teacher, Charles Argesinger at WSU, was really into the octatonic scale. So, in fact, the piano concerto ends with a big octatonic scale going up. Um, and so and again, I didn't realize that at the time. It just made sense to me and what I was doing at the keyboard. And so my parents, got me piano lessons with my piano teacher, Nancy. And, I did that throughout the rest of elementary school and middle school and the beginning of high school. And I was really into that. I was going through Beethoven sonatas by the time I stopped taking private lessons and started getting involved with other things, other music projects. And I did take like a year, maybe 2 years of piano. Now that I think about it, 2 years of piano at Washington State University at like the college level. And I do enjoy being at the piano. I do find myself making melodies at the piano a lot, or kind of getting out my frustrations at the piano when um, I'm in a room with a piano, or getting out like just kind of my emotions on the piano. So what I was gonna say is, yeah, around age of 9, I figured that out, and it's first piece, and I wrote it out, and then I started taking piano lessons. And around that time, and I think a lot of composers that I've talked to, and a lot of musicians I've talked to, around that time, the piece that really got me going, like really excited, was Dvorak's Ninth Symphony. When I heard that piece, like I couldn't get enough of it, and so I would just basically listen to that particular symphony on a repeat, just over and over and over again. And that particular CD, that sort of was my kind of gateway into getting all of my albums. We didn't have YouTube when I was in elementary school and middle school, so I remember on my copy of the Dvorak, which I think I have sitting. I have all my CDs and records right behind me in that in on those shelves. Um, but I think that uh, they had Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, and then it had the second book of his Slavonic dances, and I really got into those. And so that was sort of a good way for me to, when I went to the CD store, and you don't see those very often. You see them at Fred Meyer, and that's pretty much it. But I'd go to like Sam Goody or FYEE or Circuit City, and I'd find Dvorak and get the Slavonic dances, and then be reading the notes on that and find out, oh, like, Brahms and Dvorak were besties, so I'd go out and get the Brahms Hungarian dances, and anything that I had heard about from basically program notes as being influential to a composer, I'd go out and grab and kind of devour with my ears. So that was kind of me through the end of elementary school, throughout high school, just collecting CDs and listening and getting really into classical literature. And again, that's something I was thinking about telling you guys. If I had access to YouTube when I was your age, man, I would have been listening nonstop to everything on YouTube that I could get my ears on. Okay, did I answer everything on that question, like
I
how I
think
got started?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So let's pivot towards more specifically the tango now. So how did this piece come about, and like how do you as a composer, uh, what's the difference maybe between a commission and a labor of love, something you write for yourself, and how did this piece in particular come about? What's the background on this particular piece?
So something I've always wanted to do was be a commissioned composer. Like that's my end goal. And something, again, with me deciding not to go on and pursue my doctorate when after I got accepted and everything, is the realization that I don't have to have a certificate to say that I can be a commissioned composer. I can just be a commissioned composer without that. I don't even have to technically have my undergrad or my master's. So so I think deep down, like the fact that somebody else is asking me for my music, that means a lot to me, and it makes me want to do a really good job for them. And the story behind Tango, and I don't recommend people do what I did with this per se, but my friend Bruce Walker, who's the director of the Yakima Youth Symphony, he called me up the Sunday before Thanksgiving, um, 2013. I was getting my teaching certificate at the time, and he said, "Hey, I'd love to have a piece of music. It's a tango." He had specific um, he had specific notes about what he wanted for the piece. He wanted it to be a tango. Firstly, he wanted it to be 3 minutes long, and he wanted it to be for a particular instrumentation. And so I said, like kind of some clarifying questions about the ensemble and everything. And he said, "Yep, no, just go for it." And I realized, looking at my calendar, between doing my practicum, which is going to other schools and like writing up lesson plans every other day and whatnot, and how busy things were going to get for me in January, that I needed to write this piece really fast. And on top of that, I happened to have the opportunity to have some music read by a symphony orchestra at Western. And so I took my Thanksgiving break and I wrote Tango really quickly. I wrote it within a week. I got it so the parts are all printed out and everything, and then the symphony orchestra at Western read it down on Monday during that rehearsal. So it literally took me from the Sunday that Bruce Walker called me to um, to that Monday morning when I got the parts all printed out and handed over to the orchestra manager. And as Mr. May was asking about it being like a personal piece or a like my thoughts on it, I wrote it really quickly. It came out really quickly. I think about there's a famous quote from John Lennon, who was one of the members of the Beatles. He was talking about how the music that he's most attached to just kind of comes out of him. Like he can sit down and craft a song, but the music that just kind of comes out is usually the stuff that he felt the closest to. And there's a little bit of both of that, I feel like, in Tango, where if I hadn't had all my education on orchestration, and if I didn't have all my education on musical form and structures and whatnot, the piece wouldn't sound like how it does. I think it'd kind of meander and go all sorts of places. But but I wrote it with this background on top of this quick idea, and organically um, shooting off of those ideas and knowing when to stop and when to move on and whatnot. It's just like, in some ways, it's like writing an essay for a class. I don't think it sounds like an essay for a class, but it's the same kind of uh, process in a way musically. Okay. I don't know if I answered all of that question, but
No,
that's
okay. You mentioned something interesting in that you've always wanted to be a commissioned composer, and I know a lot of composers and maybe non-composers, slightly tongue in cheek, say that sometimes they feel like this that a second performance of a piece means more than a first performance of the piece. Do you First of all, do you agree with that statement? And then sort of the follow up to that is which brings you personally more joy, someone asking for the commission or somebody down the line then asking if then wanting to perform that piece again?
Well, there's a few things going on. It's always exciting to have a piece performed. Thankfully, it feels like the last, I don't know, 8 years or so, when I've had something performed, I've been really sure about it and really happy with the piece. I think when I was an undergrad, when I'd have a piece performed, it still was kind of like some of the pieces, not all of the pieces, but some of the pieces I knew could have had some more work done over it. And I think that part of my master's program was getting me to that point of saying, no, this is exactly what I want. This is what I wrote. This is what I intended. Um, I think starting off at the college level, getting performances was exciting and new. But I think I'm more along in that second thought that you're describing as after the premiere, getting the piece performed more. That's more exciting to me because I see the longevity of the music. And I'm going to do another name drop if you want to write this composer's name down. Eric Whitacre. When I met Eric Whitacre, he's a really famous choral composer, and a lot of his music's been transcribed really well for wind ensemble. But when I met him, he was talking a lot to me uh, about those things, about how he really feels close to his composition. So he kind of wishes that some of his pieces that don't get sold as much or performed as much, he wishes that those would get performed more. And and he's happy that the pieces that are getting performed get performed. But there's like this sort of like, he described it as sort of like a wanting the best for his music and wanting to have everything be going out there. So he told me he does tend to, when he does a lot of and he's a genius businessman too, because he just gets all these cool ideas happening and selling a lot of music. But he was telling me about he tends to try to push the pieces that aren't selling as well because he wants them to get their day in the sun. So I get that. Um, there's a second part to the question you're asking about. Uh, was it
Uh,
about?
I think you pretty much answered
Okay,
it. The question
okay,
was mostly, does the initial commission or the subsequent performances
yeah,
bring you more joy? And you've talked about the fact that
yeah,
your sort of dream has been to be a commissioned composer where people are asking you to write music for them, but it's very gratifying and satisfying to then later on down the line have someone say, "Hey, I'd like to perform this piece that you wrote X number of years ago."
right.
So specifically about the tango, and this question kind of came up when I saw you last week in choir rehearsal. Um, we talked a little bit about specificity of articulation markings, and I know that there's a lot of different marks you use between staccato dots and tenuto marks, and marcato accents or housetop accents, and the little wedge accents, and just the sideways accents. And I'm just if you could, for all of our benefit, kind of what do you mean by all of those? And what's your, because um, students, you might not necessarily know that every composer, I mean, we're taught what articulation markings mean, but every composer uses them a little bit differently and means something slightly different by them. And so if you've ever had a conductor or a teacher say contradictory things about articulation markings, that's often because depending on the piece, depending on the composer, depending on the time period, the same symbol can actually mean very different things. And so my question for Mr. Schlichting is, what's your hierarchy of articulation markings in terms of length and
Hmm.
front end of note and accent, that kind of thing, between the
Yeah,
different marks that you use?
yeah. Well, something in, I mean, it's kind of feels like second nature now, but something for me, another composer, I'm gonna name drop for you guys, Jean Sibelius. Sibelius, when I was your age, um, I wasn't enamored with Sibelius's music. I actually, uh, I was kind of confused about it and really didn't know how to interpret it. And um, it took me until like midway through my undergrad and playing this piece of his string suite called Rakastava that I finally figured out like, okay, everything's clicking for me. I understand how to play Sibelius now, or at least I'm beginning to start to learn how to play Sibelius. But like what Mr. May is talking about, Sibelius, the way he uses articulations is like very different from how like Ravel uses articulations, very different from how you'll see Bach written out with articulations. Um, and so I've kind of learned how to get into that brain space when I play Sibelius. Um, so what I was going to say about articulations in general, um, my orchestration teacher in undergrad, Ryan Hare, I mentioned him earlier, kind of got me out of my shell with a lot of things. Ryan Hare is a bassoon player, and he had a really big wind background and really big emphasis on writing for winds. And I think I mentioned offhand to Mr. May last week something about, oh, for winds, I would never put a tenuto with a staccato. And I'm looking at the first note on the piece, and I have like the flutes all doing that, and the oboes all doing that. I'm like, okay, but that's the first note before a rest. And so I can kind of argue that I don't want to have it be an accent. I don't want it to be a attack. I want it to be a get to that note, come off that note, kind of a thing. So I'm going to argue myself into the ground here. Um, so with articulations, yeah, every composer has kind of a different thing. I play in a string quartet locally called the Chinook String Quartet, and if you're one of my students and you've been to the Holiday for Strings, you'll get to see us. It's typically made up of other teachers in my district, like Mr. Sears and Mr. Sokolik and Mr. Hokut, and we switch around players for different events. So we're working up a piece, or we're working up one of my pieces for premiere. It was supposed to be tomorrow, and now it's getting pushed to February. I have no clue what's going on with that, but Mr. Sokolik, the cellist, was doing the same thing that Mr. May is talking about, where he was asking me, okay, I noticed you have an accent on these notes, but then you have these, wedges on these other notes, these marcatos and whatnot. Like, what is it that you want? And I have to demonstrate that on my violin or my viola, whatever I have out, and kind of emphasize it. Uh, I think that um, I think as a composer, you got to trust the musicians to make a good sound judgment about what's happening, and you also have to trust the conductor about what's happening and how they interpret it. Um, I think there's a quote from, I think, Isaac Stern that I heard a really long time ago, where he said something about there's 1,000 different ways you can play something correctly, and I believe that, depending on what you've got in the ensemble and what's going on. Um, um, I do have lots of articulations, but I think that I'm trying with the articulations, I'm trying to, as best I can, communicate what I want. And I have in my composition teachers, it's funny when I go through my articulations, it's usually one of the last things I do. Um, but Greg Yazanitsky, who was again one of my teachers at WSU, um, he was really big on certain notes should get articulations, no ifs, ands, or buts. Like if you have a quarter note, you need to put an articulation on a quarter note, because you're either going to have people play it really short, or you're going to have people play it really long. So you might as well tell them, is it supposed to be short or long? If you're going to, he had this kind of mentality about it. And along that note as well about articulations, Dana Wilson, again, my teacher at Ithaca, um, I actually get to see him working on his compositions and then get to hear them later, which is kind of exciting for me. But he really wasn't too concerned about those details until he was starting to clean up the parts. And I notice the more I compose now, I'm the same way. The last two pieces I wrote for the Olympia Symphony, which were wrote a piece that was premiered in 2017 called Festdrift, and a piece that was premiered in 2018 called Nisqually River Run. I'll basically write everything out, and then when I start going through the parts and cleaning up the parts and looking at the individual part, like what do I want the musician to actually, what do I want the performer to do, or what do I want the performer to think? And what I think is interesting to me about that process is that when I do it that way, typically, and I won't do it with the whole score out. I'll just go through the part. I have it by that time on my copy of Sibelius, not the composer, but the music notation software. And I'll notice as I'm putting articulations in and then going back to the score that articulation usually lining up with everything else. And very irregularly, I'll put an articulation into one part that's not in another part, and I have to kind of go through the um, worst case scenario in my head about, well, do I need to make sure that the performer needs to know that? Like, is this something that I really need to have in there? And typically, yes, I should be putting as many directions as I can in for the performer for it to be a successful performance. So anyway, so that's my rant on articulations.
All right. Well, I'm not sure I deserve that much trust, but we'll see what we come up with. Um, let me.
Can I
So
put another aside in there about trusting the conductor?
sure, go ahead.
So if you guys have access to YouTube, so you can do this. If you ever get a chance, listen to Stravinsky's recordings of the Ballet Ruses, like the Firebird and Petrushka and Rite of Spring, and then listen to Boulez's. And most people I talked to preferred the Boulez recordings of Stravinsky's music versus the Stravinsky recordings. And it's funny because they're both following their articulations, but there's something about the Boulez recording where it's I feel like a lot more polished and a lot more there. And given he probably made his recordings after Stravinsky made his recordings, so he knew where the mark was and he knew where to go over that. But Anyway, that's a I think an interesting case study of conductor composer relations.
That does get into a little bit of can of worms that we won't open up tonight, but how much do you trust composers performing their own music? And in Stravinsky's case, the evidence is that Stravinsky was a terrible conductor and couldn't keep an orchestra together. So, some people listen to Stravinsky's recording. It's like, well, he's so much slower than his metronome marking. Well, he couldn't get the orchestra to, quite plain and simple, he couldn't get the orchestra to go any faster. But if someone else conducted his music, he would criticize the conductor if the conductor went too slow. So, you have to look at all the evidence there. So I have a couple questions that have come in. Besides your teachers that you have mentioned, is there a composer that inspires you the most?
There's the two composers that like they can do no wrong in my book are Bach. Like if Bach did anything, like do whatever Bach does. And that's kind of one of my things in my head when I think about him. Some things as I was finishing up my master's in music composition that I started to realize is Bach recycled a lot. And actually, there's the composer Sam Adler. I went and saw Sam Adler talk one time, and he was had a little rant about that as well. Bach recycled, and he fit in really well in Olympia. He recycled a lot. Um, he um, he wrote a lot of music in his lifetime, but it's really funny when you start to actually like pull out like the partita movements from the violin and sonatas and partitas. He actually orchestrated some of those movements, or he actually took those and like rewrote them in a different sphere. So there's something that I really appreciate that as a composer. He wasn't burning himself out trying to come up with new things. If he had something that was a good piece, he would just rework it, and I think that's a really good lesson. And you'll start if you know that with that knowledge, you'll start to notice that with other composers too. And then the other composer in my mind that can do no wrong is Ravel. And every time I listen to Ravel, I'm really enamored with not just his orchestrations. Everyone talks about his orchestrations, but just how he wrote his music. Um, the music that he wrote seems so natural to me, but at the same time, I understand that he spent a long time crafting his music, and there's things I really appreciated about him. Going back to like conductors and whatnot, when he wrote Bolero, which that one for a long time for me was like, oh, but Ravel wrote Bolero. That's still a good piece. That's still a great piece. Like it's a good melody. It changes. It's not like his other compositions, but there's something about that particular one where it is just this elongated piece of music. And if you haven't heard Bolero yet, check it out. It's a trip. It's one of those ones you got to listen to with like headphones on. Um, uh, but there's things about Ravel and how I think Toscanini, when Toscanini performed it, I think he might have even done the premiere. I can't remember. Essentially, he took it double time, and Ravel like got really angry about that. like no, it needs to be a really slow. It's a really slow dance. It's not supposed to be this quick thing. And so I think like the traditional running time for that particular piece is 14 minutes long. Anyway, but I don't when I think about Ravel, I don't think about the Bolero typically. I think about his G major piano concerto or Daphnis and Chloe or pretty much pretty much anything he wrote is amazing. So those two composers. If you want to start talking about like living composers or recent composers, John Corgliano, and I've been fortunate enough to meet him twice in my lifetime. If you can get your hands on anything by John Corgliano, I know I don't think anybody in this orchestra, but I know like 5 years ago at least, SOGO performed Jamestown Hymn, which is one of his pieces. And actually, uh, I think just before that, the All Northwest Orchestra performed it in Spokane. And I actually contacted him, John Corgliano, to say, hey, like, are there any recordings of this particular piece? And he told me that there had not been any recordings. So I actually took the All Northwest recording that was made that year and sent it to him, and he was really thankful. Anyway, so John Corgliano and um, I would say another person that I really more recently got into is Maslanka. If you can listen to Maslanka's music, there was a year like
All the wind players are
yeah,
singing the praises now
yes,
in their rooms.
yes. Maslanka, he's a wind ensemble composer, but man, a few years ago, uh, I'm going to do some more name dropping. So after I finished my master's, I had written my master's was a piano concertino for piano and wind ensemble, and it got performed at Northwestern. And my friend who was conducting the ensemble at Northwestern, um, he had a stack of CDs in his office, and I said, "Hey, can I look through these?" And he's like, "Yeah, you can even have them." And so I took this Northwestern Wind Ensemble recording home and actually sat on my shelf for a while. And when I moved to Lacey, I dug it out and was like, I need to listen to this album. This is a pretty good album. And the last track on that is the Maslanka Symphony Number 4, and it's amazing. Like, oh my gosh, like I pull that out like every few months and listen to it. If you ever get a chance, I can maybe send that to Mr. May. But even if you're a string player, it's one of those. It's like listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony for the first time kind of pieces. Anyway, Maslanka and Corgliano, those are the two I'm going to shoot out to you who are living composers.
Um, there's so many great questions, and there's no way we have time for all of them. Can I maybe send you some of these questions, and would
Sure.
it be too much trouble to have just send you some questions and have you answer them, and then
Sure.
get get that back to the orchestra? Because
Sure. No problem.
I really like your questions, everybody, and I want to get you some answers, but I also we only have about 17 minutes left of our rehearsal, so.
Do you mind if
Um,
I add one more composer onto my list of composers?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We'll call this our finish here.
Okay. Um, oh, by the way, thank you guys for asking questions. I've done a few of these, and I'm really happy that you guys are interested in asking. Um, I'll try to get everyone's question. One other composer, and I feel bad because I feel like he gets kind of shafted nowadays, and I don't really understand why. Is John Williams? Man, like it seems like people like to be really polarized about John Williams, and it's like if you listen to his music, it's amazing. He writes these gorgeous melodies, and like I hear, it's usually people. I feel like it's composers that are just never happy. You'll meet composers that are just never happy with anything, and I don't usually hang around those composers. But I feel like it's just the composer that's just jealous that John Williams is such a great composer. But like some of the things like the salty attitude I hear about him is, oh, he doesn't do his own he doesn't do his own orchestrations. There's a lot of composers that I know that don't do their own orchestrations. They trust other people to do that because they know other people are going to do a much better job. Like I don't think that there's anything to some extent wrong with that. And I've done those kind of projects for composers too, where I've sat down and orchestrated it for somebody because they're busy just trying to turn out music. So I get that. I get that time commitment. But the more I listen to John Williams, I think he's like just up there. I think after he passes, he's like what 87 now. So
He's older than that, I
he's
think.
87. How nine?
Approaching 90. He was born in 32, so
Okay,
he'll be 89 soon.
okay,
Um,
okay. So he's. I mean,
the world won't be the same without him.
no, and so I just really appreciate him. If I think every composer kind of goes through a weird John Williams phase where they're like, I really like him, and then they kind of go, oh, it's what he's doing. It's not possible. And so, but I mean, he's one of those composers that if I ever got a film job, like a major motion film job, I'd really want to like have that be like the standard of like this is what I want it to be. This what he's did, which I feel like I go to all these movies now and they're just kind of these hyper like grooves or something. They're not. They're kind of just thrown together. So I have a big appreciation for him. All right, that's my third composer to talk about.
Well, since we did John Williams in the fall, that kind of brings us full circle. For everyone who didn't get their question answered, I do see your questions. I'm going to save the chat right now, and I will send those off to Mr. Schlichting to get some answers for the sake of time. But if everyone could give Mr. Schlichting the Zoom reaction of appreciation um, for his time. And what baffles me, and I think is just so wonderful and so well illustrated here, is this piece is 3 minutes long, and the stories of Mr. Schlichting's life and the story of the life of this piece and what inspires him. We spent 40 minutes and didn't get and there was more we could do. So think about what I want to leave you with is think about any piece you play. For every 3 minutes of music, there's over 40 minutes of story, and think about just the humanity that goes into those notes. So thank you, Austin. It was a pleasure. And I'll see you around,
Oh yeah.
and we'll make sure that you get to see our final product.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to your questions. If you didn't get a chance to, don't be afraid to ask Mr. May. I'm more than happy to sit down and take time to answer those questions. Okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and performing my music.
Well, they didn't have a choice. Thanks, Austin. All right, everybody.